Hi, thanks for being here. I'm so glad to be here today with Andrew Hartz, who's the founder of the Open Therapy Institute and a clinical psychologist. Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
I was so happy when I stumbled on the Open Therapy Institute. I think it's a great idea. So please tell people what it is.
The Open Therapy Institute is basically providing therapy referrals and clinical trainings um, to therapists for people who are overlooked in the field. So we kind of focus on issues and perspectives that are overlooked in the mental health field, um, especially related to political bias.
So trainings and what else? I'm sorry, you offer trainings and what else?
We also offer referrals to therapists.
Referrals.
Yeah, looking to see a therapist will help match patients with a therapist who is skilled at working with their issues.
Okay, great. So if you would like a therapist who is sensitive to your own political views, then I could go to you for a referral. Is that it?
That's right. Yeah.
Great. And what kind of trainings do you offer?
Well, we're just launching continuing education credit trainings for therapists. Therapists usually need to get continuing education credits to renew their license, and we're offering those on overlooked topics.
What would be some overlooked topics?
It's especially things having to do with viewpoint and political bias. So, like issues that the field isn't addressing very well, maybe people who are self-censoring or people who are attacked for their views at school or at work, or people who are religious, people who, uh, one issue, like people who are gun owners and they worry about guns being pathologized by their therapist, things like that.
Okay. And also I think there's this issue of like if you feel that your therapist is anti-male and thinks all males are toxic and you want a therapist that doesn't think that, for example.
Or you're looking for a couples therapist and you don't want to inadvertently end up with a therapist who wants to try to queer the relationship or has a feminist standpoint, which a lot do.
Yeah, okay. Whoa. I didn't know that was so self-censoring, that's a good topic because having been a college professor for years, I am very sensitive to this issue. And I certainly can imagine on the one hand, you go to a therapist and you're self-censoring because you don't want them to attack you for not having the right views. But then on the other hand, like, how can therapy work if you're just self-censoring?
Right.
So how can a person decide if they're self-censoring? Because like everybody's self-censoring and everyone feels awkward in therapy.
Oh, right. That's interesting. Um, yeah, I mean, I do think there, the question is, how do people decide if they're self-censoring?
Yeah, like I think it's so good for people to notice that they're doing that. On the one hand, you could say, I'm just going to say what I think and deal with the consequences. But then on
Right,
the other hand, you think, oh my God, my therapist will fire me, or my therapist will tell me that I'm a bad person,
right,
and I
right.
can't deal with that.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of those are great cues that you're self-censoring is what you just said. But I think a lot of times, for example, like with a lot of patients who have religious convictions, they assume the therapist is secular. They assume that this is something that they're not going to understand, even if they try, even if they want to. And they could think this is a nice person, I like them, but there's no way I would talk about my faith with my therapist because they're not going to be able to relate. They're not going to get it. And maybe they have negative attitudes towards religion or something like that. So I'll just kind of compartmentalize that. And
Mm.
they might feel similarly that there's issues related to masculinity, like you just mentioned. And they just kind of are like, well, that's something that I care about, but that's political. I'm just going to focus on this other, these other issues. But they probably are underestimating the extent to which when you start self-censoring parts of yourself, it can really derail the whole process. You cut certain things out, and then all of a sudden the emotions aren't flowing, the thoughts aren't flowing, and it it's it just inhibits the whole therapeutic process.
So another one of the potential situations you mentioned is the person who wants therapy because they feel that they're being bullied at work or at school because of their political views. And they could risk being in front of a therapist who agrees with their bullies.
Yes.
And so how would you help that person?
Well, I think you want to think about that every situation's different and people are different. So there's not a one size fits all thing. And people have to think on some level about their values and what they want. I mean, some people it's like, well, I don't want to self-censor at work, but this is the best job for me and I've got to make a living, and they just want to figure out on how to avoid this as much as possible and survive so that they can make an income. Other people, they've got to speak from the heart. They've got to say what they believe, and they're willing to take a financial hit, or other types of consequences for speaking up. So people have to weigh the pros and cons of different approaches, and sometimes think strategically about what's going to be effective here to accomplish what I want. Maybe it's not going to persuade anybody, but I need to say it for myself, to be honest to who I am. Or maybe I really do want to persuade people, and there's a way that I can do that effectively. Um, you do it, you maybe connect to other people who might be sympathetic and see if you can build allies and do it in a more strategic way. So, or maybe it's just the place isn't redeemable. Nobody's going to listen to you there, and you need to try to look for another job, if it's really unbearable. So I think there's different things people might do, but it's hard. It's hard to figure out even what you want to do when you don't have a confidential space where you can actually think through this fully. It can be it can really mess with people's mind to uh, to be in a place where they're not allowed to say what they think, and then they don't even know what they think.
Yeah. And of course, also, when a person decides that they're bullied for such and such reason, at what I write in my work is that the mammal brain is constantly comparing its strength to others because in the animal world, there's a tremendous amount of social rivalry. So we are all comparing our strength to others. We're all longing for the one up position and fearing the one down position. And so if people feel that way in their lives, everybody feels that way. So if you say, "Oh, you're putting me down because of this or this or this," it's like if it's not one reason, it's another reason. So this is what people do. So yeah, it's not. Although I agree that there's a lot of political nastiness going on. Apart from that, there's just a lot of nastiness in the mammal brain.
And you do have to kind of tease out um what's an individual issue. Like, is there people that are prone to anxiety? And right, and the issue might be anxiety, and now that might be focused on a political thing about work. They're anxious about politics at work, but if it wasn't that, it could be something
Yeah,
else.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
They actually need help with anxiety, not just the mechanics of the political situation. But it's going to be hard to address either one of them if they don't feel like they can talk candidly with their therapist.
Got it. Okay, so how did you come to establish this Open Therapy Institute?
I wrote some articles over the years, and then got a team together and got some donation money, and it's kind of just been one step after the other. I mean, I was concerned because I realized at some point that if I got a referral, it's not uncommon to see on psychological listservs of therapists, where the email listservs or something, people are just saying there's no way they would see a conservative patient. And therapists just say that pretty candidly sometimes. And
You mean they say this in their public
maybe not public facing, but definitely privately among the community, of therapists. And I just was realizing, where do people go if they want to find a therapist who it can really support them and understand what's happening and really work with them? Where do they go if they want to avoid finding a therapist who might be judgmental or hostile to their views? And I just realized there weren't any resources that I knew of to find anything like that. And there was no professional community of therapists so that they could refer to each other or start to address some of the problems that in the field. And at the same time, the trend in training programs and in hospitals and clinics and institutes has just become to be more and more politically radical. And so it's kind of, the problem seems to be getting worse over time. But there's
Yet there was
basically,
a famous article a few months ago, I think, about the politicization of the programs that train and certify therapists. Maybe I
yeah.
should include that in the show.
Was that the one was that in the Free Press?
Yeah, was that it? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I spoke to her about that article. I spoke to Lisa Selim Davis, wrote a great piece for the Free Press about that. And yeah, and people really wouldn't believe how dominated by identity politics, a particular brand of identity politics training programs are. It's a really it was an every week thing. It was coming into how cases were discussed. It was just a constant feature of these programs. And I would talk to people who wanted to get a PhD or even just get a master's. And their biggest concern about entering the field was, am I going to be able to endure the constant identity politics in these programs and the constant, I think, real hostility and fanaticism that's taken over these programs?
Yes. And when I was part of that world, which I did escape, I wrote a book about my escape. um, uh, what bothered me the most is it's so based on guilt. And I grew up with a lot of guilt. And so I felt like this was all preying on your guilt and just making you feel more guilty. And that was the whole aim of it. And in that sense, it's akin to religion, and it's anti-religion because it is its own religion.
Yeah. I mean, my biggest experience with it was the all or nothing framing of groups of people. They'd kind of say, this entire race has power and this entire race doesn't have power. And it was just across individuals, across situations. It's just all or nothing. You either have it or you don't. And it's just binary thing. Or this group is always advantaged and this group is always disadvantaged. And there's never a point when this group has disadvantages or this group has advantages. It was just this all or nothing thing. And there were real strong signals sent that deviating from that, that there were certain demographic categories that you could only say bad about and others that you could
Yes,
only say
yes.
good about.
Well, and that's been like in the movies for decades, certain
Yeah,
demographic categories are always presented as good and others are always presented as bad. But the bottom line is it's not really therapy, I think, in the sense that my view is I want to be happier. And
right.
how can you help me be happier? And their view is, no, you shouldn't be happy. You should be miserable because our society is so bad. And
Right. Right.
that's why I really broke with it, because I thought, wow, you really wanting people to be unhappy.
Well, and a lot of the interventions that they push, like, yeah, I think, and you would hear people, I mean, it's not an exaggeration. People would say, we want the patients to be angry and use
Yes,
that in
exactly,
virtual
exactly.
activism.